In this lecture, we'll talk about some more CSS properties. We'll talk about text properties, we'll talk about the width and height, the box model, shadows, background properties, and opacity and gradients. Now, there'll be a lot of new properties that I'll introduce in this lecture, and I can't cover all of the possible values and even all of the properties that we have in CSS. So make sure you look up these properties online and explore the different values and things that you can do with these properties to get a complete idea of what you can do. So I've created an HTML page here that we can style up. It has a header section, it has a navigation section, and a main content section, and a footer right here. And now I'm going to put an ID here, and remember from previous lectures, when we use an ID, we can add this ID equals onto any tag we want from the body to the body tag right here, and it's just a way that we can invent a name to call it by. So I'm going to call this name main content. Now remember, when you use an ID, you can only use it once on the page, so I can't call another tag main content. So this would not be allowed when you go to validate your page. It would complain because there's two IDs with main content, even though they're on a different type of tag. So if we want more than one ID or more than one tag to refer to it, then we can use a class instead. So since I'm putting this on a paragraph tag, I can put this class right here as well. So this we can repeat class names as many times as we want, but we can't repeat ID names. We can only have one ID name. So now that I have some IDs and classes to refer to elements in here, then I can go to my CSS page right here. Here's more.css, and I've linked this in to my HTML page right here. This is review from before, but this links in my more.css, and I've saved these both in the same directory to get this to work. So now that I have that, if I want to refer to something by its ID, I have to put a pound sign in front of it. So if we're using an ID, you have to use a pound sign to refer to things inside of this. So this will this main content, when I style it up, it will refer to this tag right here because it has an ID of main content. And then if I want to refer to my main paragraph class name, I use a period for the class name. So this indicates that it'll be a period, and then I can use that to refer to both of these paragraphs right there. So let's go ahead and start styling this up, and we'll start by reviewing a little bit. We have the font family, and first we're going to talk about text properties, the ways that we can change and style up our text. And as a review, we covered font family before, but I can make this Arial and then sans serif like that. And once I do that, the text inside of here will change. Notice just the text inside of the section right there changed, or just this text right here, because I only changed it for inside of this main section. I didn't change it for outside. So another thing that we could do with the text is change its size. So font size right here, and we can use 12-point font like that. And 12-point happens to be the default, so nothing changed. So if we want a little smaller font, we can use 8-point font as well. And then we get a smaller font. And we can also use pixels to describe how big we want our font. So this means our font size will be 8 pixels wide. And as you can tell, there's a little bit smaller, so pixels are a little bit smaller. And then there are two other ways to change the font size, or to refer to the size. So we can use point, pixel, and we can also use an EM. So if I use 1 EM, that means it's going to go back to the default. So that's a default. So if I want smaller than the default, then I have to use a number smaller than the default. So 0.8 is just a 80% of the default right there. And if I want something bigger than the default value that it's already at, then I can use a number bigger than 1, and that'll make it bigger. So basically this is kind of multiplying the size, multiplying the default size. So if I use 2 right here, then this will be twice the size of the default right there. And if I use 0.5, this will be half the size of the default right there. So that's a font size. We can also use percentage, and it works a lot like EM, except for instead of that, we use 50%, and that will be half the size, and 100% will be the actual size, and then 200% will be twice as big as the original size. So those are the different ways to do it, and I usually use the point myself, but there are advantages to using the EM in that you can make things a little bit bigger than other things, so it's really comparative, but I usually use the point size right there. So one thing you notice, I've styled this up on my main content right here, and I set this font size to 14 point. If you notice that had an effect on everything inside of the section tag right here. So it set this to 14 points, even though they're inside of a paragraph tag. So when you set the styling for a tag, it affects everything inside of that tag. Now if I wanted to set the styling for the paragraphs right here, I can go back to here and set the font size to something different. And if you notice, I'm referring to it by its class name right here. So I can go 8 point right here, and when I do that, the paragraph tags get the 8 point font. So the 8 point right here overrides the 14 point because this is more specific on a tag that's closer to it. So because this refers to this paragraph and this paragraph right here, it changes these two. Now if I had a different class name on this one, if I just called it main for example, you can tell that the 14 point font affected this paragraph right here because it got it from this section, whereas the 8 point font got it from the main paragraph, or the class where I set this to 8 point font. So you can always override the styles in here. Here's a look at what I just did. But you can always override the styles of a tag that's inside another tag. So whatever you put on this tag takes precedence over what gets put on its parent tag right there. So let me just turn this back into a main paragraph tag, and next I will talk about the font weight property right here, and I'll just do this all with the main content right here. So now we can set the font weight, and this is where we can make our text bold right there. And so now we have bold text right here. And another thing that we could do with the font weight is use numbers, but they all have to be a multiple of 100. So 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, all the way up to 900. And that's the weight of the font. So if we do 100, it's kind of makes our text thinner. And if we go all the way up to 900, right there, then we get a lot thicker text right there. So that's the font weight right there. We can go somewhere in the middle and get text that's kind of in the middle between thin and thick right there. The next thing we could do is the font style, and we can make it italic like that, and then that will make our text italic. You can also put oblique here, so that's another property that we have. So next we have the text transform, spelled like this, and with that you can change your text to all uppercase, and that makes them all uppercase. You can also do lowercase, and we have all lowercase text, And then we can also go capitalize at, and that will capitalize the first letter in each word. So this is something that you might want to put on a title or something if you want your title to be all capital letters or all lowercase letters. You can change that with the text transform property. Next we have the line height right here, and this is the spacing between lines. We can also, by the way, we can also put none here. That's the default. It'll just leave it the way it is in the HTML. So if you are going to put none, you might as well just delete this all out because that's the default. Now back to line height. We can have 1.5, and that's 1.5 spacing right there. So if we want double space our text, we can do 2, twice as high, and that'll double space it. Of course, we can also go 1 is the default. We can go less than 1, and that will cause the text to overlap a little bit as well. So that's the line height. 1 is the default, so we can go 1.5 for double spacing. The next property we'll talk about is the text align property, and this will center the text and other elements inside of the main content. So if we refresh this, we'll see that all this text is centered. Now I wouldn't recommend centering text other than titles because it's really hard to read centered text. We can also justify the text as well, and you can also put left here, but that's the default. So one important thing to remember is that this centers the text inside of it. It does not center the element itself. So what that means is it centers these paragraphs inside of the section, but it does not center the section inside of the body right here. If you notice, the body is the section's parent because the section is inside the body. The header and the nav are too. But this section right here does not get centered in the page. It centers the stuff inside of it inside of itself. So remember, a lot of times you'd want to center something, and you'll center, say, hey, I want this in the center, so you choose that and center it. But what you need to do is choose its parent and tell its text align to be centered. The next property we can talk about is the text indent, and this is how much we want to indent our paragraph. So I'll take this out and make the text aligned. I'll just put it to the left by default, and then the indent we can do 10 pixels here, and when we refresh we can see that there's about 10 pixels of spacing right here and right here, so we're indenting our paragraph. So that's the text indent. Now the next thing we can do is set the height and width of each tag. So if you imagine that each tag is a box, then we can decide how high and how wide it should be. So if we want it to be 300 pixels high, and we can just set it like that, and we refresh, you see how the footer moved down because I made the box bigger. To be able to see this better, I'm going to add a background color to this section, and we'll just make it a light gray. And now we can see that here's the box, or that section, that I put the ID on with main content right here. So this section right here is this box with the gray background. And now I've set the height to it for 300 pixels, and I can also set the width to 300 pixels as well. And then we get a box this big. Now one thing that might happen, if I take this height and make it just 100 pixels, you can see that the footer moved up here, and the text inside of the box just overflowed outside of its area. So there is a way to change that. You can go overflow is another property, and hidden right there will hide all the text that would go outside of the box. But by default, it's visible. So that's the default. And you can also do overflow scroll like that. And when you do the overflow scroll, then all the text that goes outside will be able to be scrolled. And the reason that we have this is just because we have a height and a width. If we don't have a height and a width, then the box will change size to be able to hold all of the content inside of it. So only when you set a height and a width will the overflow property take effect. By the way, you can also do percentages here. So if I just want the width to be 50% of my screen, then it's just 50%. And you can see that this is about halfway across the screen. You can also make it 80% to make it a little bigger. And then we get that. You can also do a percentage for the height as well. Now I've linked to this box model in the lecture notes. This is something that you should probably read. Every tag on the page is a box. So if we go back to our HTML right here, each tag is a box. So the body tag is a box, the header is a box, this H1 is a box, and we have this section is a box as well. Each paragraph is a box. And now that we've styled up this section, we can actually see the box with its background color, and we were able to set the size. So each box, according to the box model, has a margin, border, padding, and content. So the content is the text inside of the box, and then the padding is the space between the content and the border. And the border, if we were to draw a line around the box, that will be the border right there. And then the margin is the amount of space that the box will have between other boxes around it. So if there's a box that we have up above, then the box wouldn't get any closer to this. This margin kind of pads on the outside this box from touching anything else. And then the padding on the inside protects the content from touching the border. And so we can control the size, the margin, the border, and the padding right here. And so we can have a really thick border like we see right here, or we can have a little thin border just like this black line right here. And then we can also control the padding, which is the amount of space between the border and the content, and the margin, which is the amount of space between the outside and the next element on the screen. So make sure you read through this on the lecture notes to get a better explanation, but we'll see this in action now. Going back to our CSS. Right here, I'm going to put a background color on this, and I'm going to get rid of this height right here so that we could see all of our content right here. And I'm also going to get rid of the overflow as well. And so when we do that, we have our box right here. Now as you can tell, the padding on this side is set to 0 because the C and the D are touching the edges. The padding on this side might actually be a little bit bigger, and this is just the default values right here. It looks bigger, but that's just because of the wrap. It can't fit the word cover inside of this box right here, so it has to move it down to the next line right there. So if we wanted to increase the padding around the box on the inside, I can set a pixel value and here, and I could say 20 pixels right there, and that'll affect the padding. And now we have 20 pixels of space on the top, the left, the right, and the bottom, which makes this box bigger. Now if you look on the outside, we have the navigation links right above, and we have this footer right below. So I can see these a little bit clearer. I'm going to go ahead and add some, snap my fingers and add some styling so that we could see the background, see the exact size of these boxes. Alright, so now I've put a light blue background around these two right here with these these CSS right here. And now we can look about the effects on the margin. So the margin we can increase to maybe 10 pixels like that. And if you notice, that put 10 pixels of space around the outside of this. So the padding was on the inside and the margin is on the outside, and that prevented the box that came before and the box that comes after from merging in. And here's just a quick look at the HTML. Here's the box before this section, the main content section, and the box afterwards right here. So the next thing we can do is add a border. And with the border, we can add 3 properties. We want the thickness, so we can go do a thin border. And we want the type, we can make it solid. And then the color, I'll make mine black. So this is the black color right there, the hex shortcode for black. And if we do that, then we get a thin solid black border on this. Now I can make the border thick as well. And that's pretty thick. And if I want to, I can always use pixels. So if I really want a 10 pixel border like that, then I can do that and make a really thick border as well. I can also make my border dashed like that. And then I get a dashed line. And another option is dotted as well. I'll go back to using maybe a 3 pixel border that's solid. Like that. And now we can see the border around here as well. And just a note, you can also add these individual properties. You can add the border style property, and there's also a border color property and a border width property that you can set all of these with, but it's just easier to use this shorthand. Now one question might be, what if I want to change the padding so it's higher on the top and the bottom but not so high on the left and right sides? Well, I can control the padding for the top and bottom and the left and right. And by the way, this works the same for both the padding and the margin. So the first value is the top, and the second value is the left and right. So in this case, the top and bottom are going to be 0 padding. Now there is space in here. This space is caused by the paragraph tags, not by the content. So if I were to go down here and make my margin 0 and my padding is 0 for the paragraph tags that are inside of it, then it goes back to 0. So just showing you the HTML, notice the paragraph tags are inside of this, and I added this class right here. So by changing that with the CSS, I have the margin and the padding right here, and that sets them to, by setting them on the paragraphs to 0, then I can see the effects of the padding set to 0 as well. But if you notice on the left and on the right, we do have padding. If I wanted a padding higher on the top and bottom, then I can do a 20 pixels on the top and bottom and 0 pixels on the left and right. And then we get that. And then I can also add, say, 10 pixels for the left and right as well. So that's something that you can do with padding. I can do the same thing to that with the margin as I can do with the padding. So I have the top and the bottom, and I can also control all 4 sides. And it goes around like a clock. So at 12 noon, point straight up, and then you go clockwise, and so then you go to the right, the bottom, and then the left. So the first value is the top value, and so maybe you could stick with a 10 pixels on the top. We'll do 30 pixels on the right side, 50 pixels on the left side, and then maybe 100 pixels or 50 pixels on the bottom and 100 pixels on the left. So this is the top, right, bottom, left, right here. And so when I do this, you can tell that the top is at 10 pixels right there. We can't quite see the right unless I expand this, but the right here is 30 pixels. We have 50 pixels down here, and then the left has 100 pixels over here of margin. So that's a way that we can control the margin and the padding with that. So we can just have 2 values for the margin as well. That would be the top and the bottom, and then the left and the right. And we can have 4 values for the padding, the top, right, bottom, left. And now I'm going to set these margins to something more reasonable. So I'll just do a 10 and a 10 right there, or just maybe 10 pixels overall. And now we can see this page. let's go ahead and add a background color to our paragraphs. And this EA9 right there, which is kind of an orange color. So now we have that. Of course, I can add a little bit of margin in here, at least to the top and bottom, and leave the sides 0, so 5 pixels margin. And then that'll separate the boxes a little bit, put some space in between there. And by the way, there's only 5 pixels of margin in between here. We have 2 paragraphs, so looking again at our HTML, we have 2 paragraphs right here, and one right on top of the other. Well, our margin right here says there should be a margin on the top and the bottom of 5 pixels. So there's a 5 pixel margin on the bottom here and a 5 pixel margin on the top here. But there's only 5 pixels in between these, so the margins will overlap if things are next to each other. So the margin doesn't push somebody else, it pushes somebody else's border away from it, but it wouldn't push somebody else's margin away. They'd overlap into the margin and then start pushing the border away. Let's go ahead and add a border to this. And we'll do 3 pixels thin, or 3 pixels solid, and we'll go black again. And so there's that. Maybe a little bit thinner border, so it's not quite so thick. Now one thing that we can do with the borders is we can round the corners with a border radius. And the border radius, we can do 3 pixels like that. And if you notice, the little points on the corners kind of went away and a little bit rounded. If I increase this to say 10 pixels, then we'll see a larger circle along the corners, as we can tell. And if I go really big, say 80 pixels or something like that, we'll start to make an oval out of our boxes right here. So that's the border radius, and I can control these separately. So one can be 80 pixels. It will be the top left, and then I can do just a 5 pixel on the top right, and then 0 pixels on the bottom right, and then we'll just go 3 pixels for the bottom left corner, and we do that. And now we have a really big radius right here, a 5 pixel radius right here, no border radius right there, and then just the points gone on that. That's a little bit hard to see, and maybe I'll take this down to just 30. And now we can see that that's different. So we can control each corner of our box as well. Now one more thing that we could do with the width and the height is we can have a minimum width and a maximum width, and also for height, a minimum height and a maximum height. So we'll try this. We'll do a minimum width to start off with, and we'll say the minimum width should be 600 pixels. So what that means is no matter what, the width of the main content is going to be 600 pixels. So when we refresh that, it's going to be at least 600 pixels. So here we see that the content scrolls off to the left of the right of the page because it has to be at least 600 pixels. Now as I make this bigger, we can see that it will get bigger if we want it to. So it'll always get bigger, but it'll at least be 600. So if we did a maximum width instead of we'll do 200 pixels here. So the maximum width it could be is 200 pixels. Now it could always be smaller if we want it to, but at most it'll be 200 pixels wide. So that's one more thing that we could do with the width and the height to control things. Now sometimes we want to center some content, center all of our content on the page. So we'll work on that next. I'm going to just set this width to a fixed width at 350 pixels right here. So we have a 350 pixels, and maybe I want to center all of this content in the page and kind of have a sidebar on the side. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my HTML, And I'm going to add this right here, this wrapper, and this thing right here. So I added a div tag right after the body and before my header, and it contains all of my content, including the header and the footer, and then I have a closing div tag here at the end. So what that did is I was allowed to wrap up all of my content in a div tag. So now we can go to style this, and to start styling this, I'm gonna first of all start styling up the body and add a background color, and we'll do a light gray background color, just like our main content right there. So now we have this light gray background color, and now with the wrapper, and if you notice I put an ID on my div tag as an ID of wrapper. Now it doesn't have to be wrapper, you can name it whatever you want, but I named mine wrapper. So when I get the wrapper here, I can add a different background color, and I'm going to turn it back to white right there. So now notice my wrapper right here has a white background. And I'm also going to set this width to 400 pixels. And see how that looks. And so now we have our main content. Now this is a little bit small for a real HTML page, but since I have a smaller window from this video, this it might be a good size for the width of my main content. The only problem is it's not centered on my page. So I'd like to center it, and I can do that pretty easily by setting the margins on the wrapper. So the margin left, I'm going to make auto, and if I do that, notice the auto means just make it whatever, and the margin right goes to the default, which looks like about 5 pixels or something like that, or maybe even 0, and this is padding on the body. But anyways, so the margin left says, why don't you determine this, so it kind of is a flexible space over here on the left. So if we add that on the right as well, and add a flexible margin on the right, then it will just center it between the left and the right. So that's the way that we can get all of our content centered on the page. Is step 1 is to add a wrapper that contains all of our content right here. And this is one difference between a div tag and a section tag. The section tag I put in here because I knew this was my main content, or this section of my page. Whereas the wrapper, I just needed a box to contain stuff, so that's why I use a div tag. Whereas if I'm going to create a new section on my page, I should probably use the section tag instead. But anyway, step 1 is to add the wrapper that contains all of our content. Then step 2 is to set a width on that wrapper, or else it will span to the entire width of the page. So you have it centered, but just be the entire width of the page. And then we can do this on the left and the right. Now, by the way, I can also set the margin here to auto, and we'll go ahead and decrease this width right here. So now we have this width, but it's not centered on our page, and we could go ahead and set the margin on the top to 10 pixels, and then this is the top and the bottom onto 10 pixels, and then for the left and right we can do auto right there, and now it centers that inside of this box. So that's a way to center a box inside of another box. But with that, you do need to set the width on these, and then you set the margin to auto. So another thing we can do is add a shadow behind this box right here, or any box on our page, and that'll make the box appear like it's floating above the other stuff. So to add a shadow, we use the box shadow property. And the first number we put is how far to the right should the shadow go. So if I put a positive number, say 3 pixels, then the shadow will go 3 pixels to the right of the box. The second number is how far below the box the shadow should go, so I'll do another 3 pixels below the box. The third number is the blur radius, and this is how sharp of a line do we want this shadow, do we want to kind of have it fade out as we go, so we'll do 1 pixel for that. And the last parameter is what color should the shadow be, so a good shadow color is 828282. So we'll save that and we'll see what kind of shadow we get. Now we see that we see the shadow right here, right there. And just to show you the effect of some of these, if we have a stronger blur radius, say 3 pixels, and you'll just notice a little detail, so that how that line became a little more blurred right there. If we go to 0 pixels, right there, then we'll get a straight line and it doesn't blur at all. So you can play with that. We can also move the shadow up above the box. So now the shadow goes up here and to the left and to the right of the box, and we can also move the shadow to the left of the box by putting negative numbers. So there we have that shadow on that side. Now another thing we can do is add shadows to text. So I'll add a shadow to this H1 tag up here. So we have an H1 tag. Inside of our header, just to look at the HTML, we'll add it to this right here. And it's the only H1 on the page. I'll probably want to select this by using a classroom ID. But for this demonstration, I'll just select it using by the tag name. And we can add a box or a text shadow to it. And it's pretty much the same parameters, so we'll go 3 pixels, 3 pixels, 3, maybe 1 pixel, and we'll use the same color right there. And now we could kind of see the shadow behind the text over here. Now I've downloaded a background image right here of some trees, and I'm going to put this background image on my wrapper right here, so it'll cover this white part right there. And I named it trees.jpg. Now one common mistake that some people make is have a space right there. Make sure you don't have a space. If you put a space, it won't work. So now we'll do that, and we see we have these trees right here. And we can also scale those trees with a background size, and I can make it 100% right there. And now we could see the trees here, and they are getting repeated, so let's go ahead and make sure the background doesn't get repeated. And we'll do no repeat right there. And so that size is 100%. If I do a 100% by 100%, then we'll scale both the height and the width like that. And if another options for these, we can also use pixel values, so 100 pixels by 100 pixels. And then we get it that size. And another thing that we can do is we can do contain. And then it scales it the farthest so that it contains the entire background. This is if you want to see the entire background, then you'd want to use contain. And there's also cover as well. And this means that you want the entire background covered. So we'll leave it like that. And now it's a little bit hard to read this text up here. So I'm going to go back to this H1 and I'm going to add a background to it. And I'm color, I'm going to turn it back to white so that we'll have a white background. And there's our white background over the trees, but now we can't see the trees underneath. So when you want to see stuff behind other stuff, we can add opacity. And I'm going to do 0.6, so this is a number between 0 and 1, so if I do 0.6 right there, now we can see through this thing. Now the opacity affects the text and the background as well, so now we could kind of see through this text here. and that's the opacity of an object. And we can also affect the see-throughness of the text itself. And how we do that is through the alpha channel. So I'm gonna just comment this out right here. So now that we're back to that, we have this right here, but we can't see through this text. If we want to be able to see through the text, I could choose a color, and I'm going to use the RGB model to choose the color, and I'm going to choose a color that's not bright blue, but maybe half bright blue. So this is RGB. Remember, this is the blue value right here. So now I have this color right there. And if I want to be able to see through it, I can add an opacity or add an alpha channel right here. The alpha channel is how transparent the text is, or how well you can see through it. So this is, again, is a number between 0 and 1. So we'll try a number pretty low. And that's very see-through. If you can see, you can almost see the background image right through it. We can make it less see-through by doing 0.8 as well. And now we could just barely see through it. And so you could change with that alpha capacity or the alpha value right there so that you could see through your text and other elements as well. Now another thing we can do is add a gradient as a background image. A gradient is something that starts as one color and slowly transitions to another color. To do that, we use the background image property, and instead of defining a color, we use a linear gradient. And the first thing we could do is tell it the direction. So we can go to the bottom, and we'll start out as completely white. And we'll go to this color right here. And it's kind of a light blue color that I put in there. And so we'll save that. And we'll see this gradient and see it starts off as white and goes to the light blue color. And we can also have it go to the right if we want the gradient to go horizontally across and to the top as well. And then the gradient goes up this way. Now, this is the browser agnostic way of determining a linear gradient. It should work in most modern browsers, but as new features get introduced, browsers kind of add their own extensions. So I'm going to snap my fingers really quick and add in all the different ways that other browsers have to define this linear gradient. Okay, so this is WebKit's way of doing it. And by the way, WebKit is the the rendering engine for Chrome and Safari browsers, and this is for Internet Explorer. This is for a little known browser called Presto, and then this works in Firefox right here. Now as of this recording, Firefox definitely supports the linear gradient, and I think these other browsers might. But if they don't, then if the current version doesn't, then putting this in will help the current version get it. So make sure you check online and figure out the correct way to do this. Just so you know, this is when a property starts with a hyphen like that, and then the name of the rendering engine. And that's just an experimental feature that they've added so that people can kind of create web pages using that experimental feature. And usually experimental features get put into CSS permanently, like this background image. But then the browsers need to catch up and start supporting this. So every once in a while we'll have some browser-specific properties right here, and you just have to put them all in. Now the last thing I should do in case it doesn't work is add a background color at the top, just in case they don't work. So I'll use the AF A5CE right here. And again, this is just a backup in case the browser doesn't understand the linear gradient, then it will fall back and have this color as a background. So we'll see that. Now I can't possibly cover all of the different things that you can do in CSS, but you can go to a website like w3schools.com and you can take a tutorial and you can learn about all of the different CSS properties. So we have a CSS reference right here. So we have the background property right here, and you can click on these and you can explore different things that you can use with the background property. It tells you the different things that you can do with it, different background stuff that apply, and you even have this place where you can try stuff out on your own, and it lets you edit it. So this is W3 Schools. You can also search for other tutorials on CSS and other references so that you can go through the references and find out how CSS properties work and what different values you can have and what CSS properties are out there. Another good thing about this website is it tells you all of the different browsers that support it. So Internet Explorer, Firefox, Opera, Chrome, and Safari. So that's one way to explore it. Another way to explore it is to use an extension. If you're using Firefox, you can add the Firebug extension right there. So you just go up to the menu, the Tools menu, and you go to Add-ons right here, and you can search for Firebug. And this is all within Firefox, and I've already installed Firebug, but you can you should find Firebug right here, and you see that I have Firebug installed right here, and this is the symbol for it. And once you get Firebug installed, if you want to see how they did something, well, how did they get this to underline when I moused over it? You inspect element with Firebug, and then you make sure you're selecting the right element that you want. And then you can go over here and you can see all of the CSS rules that they have. In the Chrome browser, you also have the same tools. They're installed by default, so you don't have to install a plugin. Just right click on something and go to inspect element, and you're on the thing the element that you want to look at right there in your HTML, and then you can see the styles that apply to it. Good thing you can go ahead and turn the styles on and off and see how they take effect as well. And you can also change them. So if you want to look to see how a different color would look on the web page right there, you can see that I changed it. So these developer tools are really helpful in figuring out how the CSS is affecting your page, and it's also a good way to debug your page. So if we go back to our page that we just created, if something isn't working on this page, then I can right click and go view page source, and I see this page source right here. And if my CSS isn't working for some reason, I can click on this and make sure that I have my CSS. Once I have that, right click, inspect element with Firebug, and you can see if there is any property that's missing. You can go through your HTML and see the different properties. You can also turn on and off things, and you can experiment with it. So Firebug and the developer tools are a very valuable tool, and usually when you design a web page, you don't start off with, oh, let's use this property and this property. You usually start off with a vision of what you want it to look like, and then you need to figure out what properties you need to adjust to make it look like that. So a good way to do that is find a page that you like, and then go ahead and explore the page and look at its HTML, and then look at its properties.